Good evening, everybody, and you are very welcome to this evening's webinar, hosted by the LUMIERE Language Use and Multilingualism in Education Research Group, founded in 2023 at the School of Education, Trinity College Dublin. We're delighted that you can join us, and on behalf of all of my colleagues who are members of this group, welcome to this evening's webinar. However, it is welcome this afternoon to our esteemed speaker, Professor Catherine Snow, coming to us from Massachusetts. Professor Catherine Snow is a professor of cognition and education and faculty co-chair for literacy and languages concentration at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Professor Snow is an expert on language and literacy development in children, focusing on how oral language skills are acquired and how they relate to literacy outcomes. Professor Snow was president of the American Educational Research Association from 1999 to 2000 and chair of the RANT Reading Study Group from 2000 to 2002. Catherine's current research activities include a study of how Boston Public School early childhood classrooms are supporting children's development and participation in a long-standing research practice partnership that is developing curricular tools to support teachers in introducing innovative classroom practices. Word generation, a discussion-based academic language and literacy program, has been shown to improve middle school literacy outcomes, in particular for students from minority language homes. Catherine, it is with great pleasure that you're joining us this evening, and I'd like to pass over to you now to share your screen and to get set up for what promises to be an exciting talk.
Thank you very much, Gavin. It's a pleasure to see you again, if only over Zoom, and to have this opportunity to talk to you a bit about what I've been thinking about the role of language in literacy development. This has been an obsession of mine for a very long time, but it's a topic that I think has become rather urgent, at least in the North American discourse about literacy instruction. We are as engaged in a discussion as polarized around the field of literacy instruction as our other political discussions are. And it is my view that the role of language has been much left out of that discussion. So that's sort of what I'm going to talk about today. The issue in American reading instruction has always been how do we teach decoding and then get to comprehension? And I would prefer that we sort of turned that sequence onto its head and thought about getting from comprehension to decoding. In other words, starting in early childhood classrooms with a big focus on language development and knowledge development, which are the bases for reading comprehension, and use those as a way to then support early instruction in decoding and phonological awareness and phonics and fluency, which inevitably in a orthography as deep and complicated as English have to take up a certain amount of time, but perhaps not quite as much as they currently do. So rather than jumping on this pendulum of going back and forth from thinking about decoding to thinking about language-based, meaning-focused methods of teaching reading, I would like us to sort of stop the pendulum and recognize that decoding and comprehension are could be thought of as being in a benign cycle, each of them supporting the other at every stage of literacy development. This is not the default view in North America at the moment. And the current public discourse in the US is that we are in the middle of a crisis about reading development and reading instruction, that our fourth grade reading scores have plummeted, that as a result of which 38 of the 50 states have undertaken legislation making certain demands on schools and teachers for the kinds of curricula they can use, the kinds of practices they may or may not use. They've imposed changes in district policies. And there's a lot of parental activism. Parents have gotten very agitated about whether their children are learning to read well enough. And that, of course, feeds the legislative activity. I think that's all rather dangerous. I'm not sure that the politicians who are taking these actions are sufficiently informed about the complexities of reading instruction to be given any power in those discussions. But they have seized upon this term, the science of reading, and have placed all of their faith in the science of reading, however they interpret that term. And the way that's interpreted is quite different in different parts of the discussion, of the ongoing discourse. But as this is just a tiny example of what I could show you from newspapers across the country, the Pennsylvania House passes science of reading legislature. The Colorado state has a bill on training in the science of reading. And so the question is, where is this distress, this sense of crisis come from? Why are we engaged in it? And is there anything in the science of reading that will actually help us get better at teaching kids how to read? So a first question that one could pose is there a crisis? What is the nature of the crisis in American reading? Here are historical data from our National Assessment of Educational Progress, the so-called Nations Report Card, from 1992 through 2022. And I don't know how other people see these grade 4 scores in a historical perspective, but they look pretty damned flat to me. I don't think there's any severe crisis going on in recent years. Now, there is a little dip, which is, of course, associated with the fact that the schools were closed during COVID. That same dip can be seen here in the grade 8 scores. So scores down 3 points, not a significant decrease. And if anything, I would think people should be pleased about this. I mean, if we close the schools for almost a full school year and scores don't go down, that is the thing that should be worrying to educators. So these dips here, I think, are being recovered already. And in any case, they do not represent anything that I would refer to as a crisis. And in fact, if you look at US students in the most recent PISA reading assessment, we score as one of the 19 countries above the mean and the OECD countries that participate. And, we're in sort of the middle of that good enough group. I would point out that Ireland is almost at the top, which makes me wonder why you are listening to me talk about reading instruction, because it seems as if folks in Ireland have done a fairly good job of this on their own, at least by age 15. Kids in Ireland score quite well on this international assessment. Of course, none of us can deal with the skills attained in Singapore, but that's an unrealistic standard to begin with. So in short, we have a discourse in this country that is sort of focused on this notion that we have a crisis that we have to solve with legislation, and yet there is no real crisis, except there's a crisis of confidence in reading instruction that I would argue is leading to potentially disruptive actions. I think what we need to do here is kind of get back to the basics. What do kids need in order to learn to read? And I prefer to think of this not as a set of instructional demands, but a set of opportunities to learn. And the opportunities to learn, which I would say I put them around a triangle to suggest that they're all equally important, are opportunities certainly to grasp to get explained to one the nature of the alphabetic principle and to practice enough to master the alphabetic principle. That is one key opportunity that young children need. But equally, or perhaps even more important, the opportunity to develop broad and deep language skills linked to content knowledge, and the motivation to be literate, under which I include the knowledge of what literacy is for. I mean, why are we bothering? And the instructional practices in many American classrooms at the moment seem to be convincing children that the point of learning to read is to practice reading, rather than to understand the end of the story, or to learn more about frogs, or to have any of those opportunities for enjoyment and curiosity that ultimately is the reason we want a literate citizenry. But the U.S. reading wars, I should say, this is a current version of what has been a long, long history. John Dewey in the 19th century argued for a strongly meaning-based approach to the English orthography, whereas the McGuffey brothers wrote a set of primers that emphasized phonics, which got very widely used in 19th century American schools. But a reaction against the phonics dominance led to a use in the early 20th century of the whole word approach, in which reading textbooks were very limited in the number of words that they used, so that kids could understand the meaning of the text and not have to worry about the details of decoding individual words, because they could memorize the few hundred words that were included. Of course, there had to be a second step if you take that approach that many teachers forgot about. But in 1955, there was a revolution in American education when a guy named Rudolf Flesch wrote a book called Why Johnny Can't Read that completely changed the approach and reintroduced very much a phonics emphasis in American schools. Interestingly, Rudolf Flesch had learned to read as a child in Germany, so he'd learned to read with a shallow orthography, and was very puzzled that anybody would want to approach reading as anything but a decoding phonics-based process. But the retreat to a phonics-based process led to a lot of drill and kill approaches in classrooms, which led in the 1980s to a reaction called whole language. Let's not worry about the details. Let's let kids enjoy reading and enjoy being read to, and they'll figure it out on their own, the way they figure out how to read. That led to a very serious split in American education that was meant to be resolved by a report from the National Academy of Sciences, published in 1998. However, that report was then followed very quickly by another report that seemed to disagree. I'll talk a little more about that. And it seemed to emphasize phonics much more. And that led people to then introduce this idea of balanced literacy. Now, I have to put asterisks in the term balanced literacy now, because it has become a dirty word. It is absolutely not, balance is not a word one can use in American education. So we have arrived now at the current solution, the science of reading. Let me be very clear, I'm not against science. I think science is a good thing. I don't think there is a science of reading. I think there's a lot of science about reading, but not a science of reading. And there certainly isn't a science of teaching reading, which is, of course, what we would really like to have if we're focused on improving outcomes for kids. But let me talk just a little bit about this National Academy's report, which I happen to chair, so it has a fun place in my heart. And it was funded, interestingly, by the Office of Special Education, because such a high proportion of the budget for special education was being spent on kids who were not in any sense in need of special education. They just didn't know how to read. And this was a study that used the standard practice of the American National Academy of Sciences, put together a panel of experts, researchers and practitioners, find a chair who is not identified with any particular solution to the problem in question. So that's why I was picked as the chair, because I had never published anything about literacy in 1998 when this report was done. And so I was in that very troubled and contentious field. I was somewhat ideologically pure or innocent, shall we say. But we took a pretty broad developmental view of literacy and a kind of a public health orientation, not how do you teach kids to read, but how do you keep them from failing at reading. This report came out, and people in the government decided it wasn't rigorous enough. So they funded almost immediately a kind of a counter report that did a meta-analysis of instruction. And the counter report had a lot of political will behind it, with the result that it became the basis for national legislation called No Child Left Behind and Reading First. And when that happens, of course, then it becomes something much closer to well-funded public policy. So rather than focusing on opportunities to learn, the National Reading Panel report focused on what skills to teach and what evidence we have for the kind of instructional programs that work in experimental studies. Rather than an integrative developmental approach, it took a kind of a componential experimental approach, and constrained its recommendations to the first years, to K to grade 3, the first years of teaching reading. In other words, it focused on phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, with a little nod to vocabulary and comprehension, but very little, a very brief nod. Now, there was nothing in this report that disagreed with anything in this other report. They could have been taken as complementary, but they weren't, for reasons that I could explain. If it were 5 p.m. in the US and not in Dublin, I would have a large drink and explain that to you. But since I still have to work this afternoon, I won't. But those two reports, in a sense, again reminded us of how hard it was to achieve any consensus. And so you might ask, is there anything that everybody agrees on and think about teaching reading? And I guess if there is one, it would be the Scarborough reading rope, which I might well be familiar to you all, and which I think science of reading adherents love, and which those of us who aren't science of reading adherents find just fine as well. This is the reading rope, for those of you who haven't seen it. It distinguishes, it's a very componential view of reading and reading development, and it argues or displays the components that have to do with language, including background knowledge and vocabulary and syntax and verbal reasoning. And those grow and develop and become more tightly wound together. And then when kids start to learn how to read, to decode, do conventional reading, they get skills in phonological awareness and decoding and sight recognition of highly frequent words, and those get bound together. And those two strands finally braid together into what you might think of as skilled reading, which is automatic on the decoding side and strategic on the language side. So I think this is was a brilliant synthesis done by Hollis Scarborough of a lot of research, and it makes clear that you have to pay attention to many different components in reading instruction. But in a sense, it it reinstitutes, it represents this sharp distinction between meaning and code. The language comprehension side, the word recognition side, again, raises the question, well, where do you start? When you've got a 5-year-old in kindergarten, where we now increasingly begin to teach formal reading, or in first grade, where we used to teach kids to read, what do you do first? Because if you really believe that meaning and language is where you should start, you might want to do more of a whole word, whole language method at the very beginning. But if you really believe that the code is where you need to start, then you obviously need to spend your time focusing on phonological awareness and phonics. So do you rely on inference and induction, or do you rely on explicit direct teaching? And both sides of the argument have their points. I mean, phonics is efficient, and letters are, of course, central to reading for meaning. And there are kids out there who need explicit instruction in phonics. Different estimates, maybe 30% need explicit instruction, maybe 75% need explicit instruction. But certainly there are some kids who need explicit instruction, and some who need very intensive explicit instruction. So if teachers are going to teach those kids, they need and value guidance in how to teach the alphabetic principle. On the other hand, meaning is motivating. Meaning is why we're learning to read, and language is central to meaning. Some kids, and this can mislead those of us who are perhaps a little less convinced of the importance of phonics, some kids figure out the code on their own. They show up at the breakfast table one day and start reading the newspaper at the age of 4, proving that you can indeed figure out this system. Those are kids who happen to have very rich language systems and live in highly literate homes, typically. The work of of being a student in a phonics-focused classroom is really boring, and phonics focused methods typically rely on rather scripted curricula that reduce teacher professionalism and teacher autonomy. So there are definitely arguments on both sides, and neither of these political positions has all the answers. And neither one of them, to tell you the truth, spends enough time thinking about language and building the language skills and the knowledge skills that children need to do well in either form of instruction. So, all right, this is just an interesting little chart that I put in here because it's very puzzling to me. Just last week, the RAND group put out a survey study in which they asked a very large number of K through 12th grade teachers whether they engage frequently, that is to say, at least more than a few minutes within the past 5 lessons with all of their students, in instruction focused on what they think of as the 4 basic reading skills: print concepts, phonological awareness, phonics, and fluency. This is the consequence of the National Reading Panel report that these are emphasized. And the darkest blue column here is K for kindergarten, first grade teachers, and then teachers in 2nd through 5th grade, and then teachers in 6th through 8th grade, and then teachers in high school, in 9th through 12th. And so if you think about this, you see, well, yeah, there's a pretty good, most teachers in kindergarten, first grade, and many teachers in the next tier of grades are paying attention to print concepts, to phonological awareness, to phonics, and to fluency. But the really alarming thing is that they're still doing that in grades 6 to 8 and grades 9 to 12. And nobody should have to be doing that anymore in those higher grades. That should not be the focus of instruction, and except in remedial classes or in classes for, severely dyslexic students. So, all right, this is just an interesting little chart that I put in here because it's very puzzling to me. Just last week, the RAND group put out a survey study in which they asked a very large number of K through 12th grade teachers whether they engage frequently, that is to say, at least more than a few minutes within the past 5 lessons with all of their students in instruction focused on what they think of as the 4 basic reading skills: print concepts, phonological awareness, phonics, and fluency. This is the consequence of the National Reading Panel report that these are emphasized. you could argue they're not doing enough of this in the early grades, and that's why they still have to do some in the older grades, or that the message has come through all too clearly that literacy instruction is all about the code and not about the meaning, even at an age when students should be exploiting decoding skills to access meaning. So I'm puzzled by this, but I bring it up in case other people have similar questions about what it actually means. But let me go back to our history. I mentioned the McGuffey-Dewey conflict. McGuffey produced this whole series of readers for first through fifth grade. And I think they're really brilliant. In fact, they've been reprinted and are being used by many homeschooling parents these days. These were widely used in the 1880s in the US. And here is a typical lesson. There's a phonics chart here with little bits of information about how to pronounce words in different contexts. But what the children were meant to learn is on the right side here. We have whole words, we have phonemes, and we have a little text, a limited text, but a text that children who have learned these words can now read. You go from this in lesson 1 of the primer to 30 days later, lesson 25, being able to read texts like this. The brave men in our boat are on their way to the ship. They will save the men in the ship if they can. They will not let them drown. It's not literature, but it's a fairly challenging, complex, coherent text. And that shows remarkable success in teaching the code and using meaning throughout the process of teaching the code. McGuffey's own theory of this is very explicit, use very short words that can be remembered as whole words in the early lessons and gradually introduce longer and more difficult words and include text using those words in every lesson. So that's where we were 140 years ago, and I don't understand why we have gone backwards instead of forwards in thinking about how to teach reading in this country. The likely scenario, I'm afraid, is that the science of reading which is interpreted very widely as more phonics, more phonics, more phonics, will get adopted, and students will come to think that, because of the nature of instruction, that accurate word reading as fluently as possible, as quickly as possible, is their primary goal, that people will be teaching the code for the first 2 or 3 years of school, and the notion that that code should be connected to meaning will be postponed. This may well produce a rise in first and second grade reading scores, but ultimately, I think a decline in scores in science and in history and in literature and in all those domains that require background knowledge and persistence in reading and understanding that reading is meant for meaning. And then we'll be back in a place where people say, oh, see, this isn't working, and phonics instruction, which many kids need, will get thrown out, and we'll begin on the cycle all over again. Just to give you a sense of what this phonics focus looks like in the schools, this is material disseminated by the state government of Massachusetts with strong recommendations that kids should spend time doing worksheets like this. Here we're focusing on sh and ch, with very short phrases and very inauthentic tasks. Check the right box for each of these brief phrases, or circle the word that goes with the picture, where the picture is, the words are not even distinguished by the target phoneme, grapheme in any of these cases. So it's not exactly clear what the child is learning from practicing this, these little circle challenges. And that's, I think, absolutely emblematic of inauthentic literacy instruction. Literacy in order to demonstrate that you have learned the rule, not in order to be engaged in something that would be considered relevant to your life or interesting for its own sake. The same group, the same state group, suggests that kids take home these stories to read with their parents, and read aloud, and then talk about the events in the story with your parents. So now let's think about that. Your kid comes home with a story that goes, Kit's pal Fred gulps his milk. Fast Fred gulps and gulps. Fred gets milk on his desk. Fred gets milk on his pants. Fred gets milk on Kit. Kit gets mad at Fred. Stop it, Fred. What are we going to discuss here? There is nothing discussable in this little story. It is, except how stupid it is, which 6-year-olds, I can tell you, fully recognize. So again, this is so inauthentic as text or as task that it's precisely the kind of thing that deviates from what we think literacy is all about. It does not in any sense match the language skills of the 6-year-old or the the critical thinking skills of the 6-year-old. Now, I was so angry at this that I sat down and wrote a memo to the idiots who had developed it all. And I said, look, in 5 minutes, I could write a better story. I could write a story that at least has an authentic assessment associated with it. This is a story. You want sh and ch? Okay, I'll give you a story about a fish with a wish who wanted a bath and a chimp who helped him, and the discussion between the chimp and the fish about what a bath really is, that it has boats and ducks. And then the authentic assessment is the child is asked to draw for this sad fish, bubbles in the water, a rubber duck, and a boat. All right, this is not high level first grade reading instruction or assessment, but it's a hell of a lot better than a large committee in the state of Massachusetts came up with as recommendations to first grade teachers. And this was literally something I did in 10 minutes. So I really think we need to think much more creatively and open-endedly about what might motivate students and how they can link their nascent decoding skills and their need to practice decoding with real stories, with real authentic literacy tasks. I would love to show you an example of good kindergarten literacy instruction, what I consider good kindergarten literacy instruction. This is a kindergarten class where children have spent a few weeks learning about butterflies. They have a number of books which have been read aloud to them. They themselves are not yet independent readers. The teacher here is following a method introduced by Lily Wong Fillmore, which is a version of very targeted close reading in order to analyze language in texts. Lily calls it the juicy sentence method. From every text, she picks, she suggests the teacher pick a juicy sentence. So having read this very complicated book several times, the previous day the teachers selected this juicy sentence for further analysis. The most awe-inspiring event in a butterfly's life is its metamorphosis as it transforms from egg to caterpillar to chrysalis, emerging as a creature of delicacy and grace, filling our sky with color. And the students the previous day had analyzed this and dictated their own sentences, each sentence sort of identifying one proposition or claim that you could infer from this long and complicated sentence. I cannot play this because if I do, you won't be able to hear it, and I would love to have you hear it. So I think Anne is going to play it.
Catherine, the video never landed into my inbox, so I'm afraid it's sitting somewhere in the ether.
I'm very sorry about that.
Sadly.
Okay.
I'd love to try it again with to see if it works here, but it's too much to hope.
Okay. Well,
sorry about that, Catherine.
Sorry about that. But each of these different colored clauses, I'll just show you what it looks like so that you can see, even though you can't understand it. The kids are reading the sentence in chorus, and she's saying, we spoke yesterday about how graceful and delicate the butterfly is when it emerges. And here are your sentences. So these are sentences they had written. The butterfly is, so now they're focusing on delicate and beautiful. The butterfly is beautiful like a flower. The butterfly has colors like a rainbow. And the butterfly is like a dancer. And so the teacher has let the kids analyze this complex sentence in ways that make it simpler and more accessible to them, but then is working at putting it all back together again so that they have multiple readings of each of these clauses. And kids are learning about butterflies in the process they're engaged in, reading sentences, dictating sentences, learning how to read specific words. And I promise you they are acquiring some representation of phoneme-grapheme relationships, although they might need some explicit instruction in that too, as well. So key roles for the adults in this classroom were confirming the children's right to ask about butterflies. There were enormous numbers of child questions. Nurturing curiosity and a love of learning and demonstrating how literacy is usable in support of that effort. And of course, building language knowledge, words like chrysalis, butterfly, proboscis, pupa, larva, and so forth are all inevitably part of this conversation. But also, the adults have to ask good questions, open-ended, not test questions, about interesting topics, and presuppose that students will discuss the answers with one another to these interesting questions. One of the things you didn't see was a little turn and talk where all of the kids were discussing with one another what they had learned from reading about the butterflies from the previous day's reading. Why am I talking about butterflies rather than phonics? Well, one reason is that I think a very distressing finding from the 2021 Pearls are report data from students about whether they very much like reading or not. So they report, this is percentage of students who report they very much like, somewhat like, or do not like reading. For students in schools that are ranked here by how much they like reading, but also showing relationships to how well the students are reading. And the US is 47th out of 57 countries in how much students like to read. In other words, students in the US, really fourth graders here, really don't like to read very much. And if they don't like to read, then they are not in a position to continue to develop the language and knowledge skills that reading would give them. You can see that Ireland does a little bit better, but not brilliantly on this liking to read dimension. And so even if Ireland does very well on reading proficiency, it doesn't do a lot of good to have proficient readers who never read, because they are then forfeiting the advantages of being proficient readers. So this this study also showed a relationship, not super strong, but modest relationship between liking to read and reading achievement at fourth grade. If that relationship is likely to get stronger as students get older, and liking to read means that they read more and better, and not liking to read means that they read less and thus do not increase proficiency at the same rate. So I'm trying to promote here a really developmental view of talking for reading, in which preschool, kindergarten classrooms should be full of comprehension before decoding, in which dialogic book reading, authentic literacy tasks like doing science and recording observations, making notes, doing drawings, is a standard part of the preschool kindergarten classroom, because it's a way that clearly leads directly into authentic purposes for producing literacy forms, but then also for doing research and getting help in reading to acquire new information. In kindergarten and first grade, Nell Duke, for example, has done wonderful work describing authentic literacy tasks for kindergarten and first grade classrooms. Writing, for example, a guide to the local zoo meant for first graders. So the first graders wrote it at a first grade level because that's the level at which they could read or write, but that's perfectly authentic because they were writing it for other first graders. They had to go do research to do it. They had to look up, what do you want to tell the visitors to the zoo about llamas or yaks or elephants? But at the same time, it was authentic for them to produce these texts, these guides at a first grade level. At second through fifth grade, I think there's enormous value in analyzing text for meaning. And the Wong-Fillmore juicy sentence method is one way of doing that. Not because you want to analyze every text, every sentence in every text for meaning, but because doing that for 5 or 10 minutes a day reinforces the focus on the language structure, the language complexity, and the need to sometimes struggle with language in order to get to meaning. And that's what I think close reading and juicy sentence approaches demonstrate to children very, very well. And then as kids get older, of course, focus on analyzing texts for stance, understanding who wrote this and why and what point are they trying to make. These are authentic literacy tasks, and they are all strongly supported by classroom discourse, open discussion in the classroom. These are not tasks, autonomous literacy tasks. These are tasks that should be undertaken in a sociocultural context. So I could show you this fourth grade class digging into Don Quixote, but I won't because, but again, it's a sentence written on the board, which is a very hard sentence. This is a Spanish language class. These are Spanish-speaking kids, but they're American Spanish speakers, and Don Quixote, even this adapted version of it, is written in rather complicated Spanish. So you have this one sentence, para ello, ni corto ni perezoso, se dispuso a quitar las armas que cubrían la pila, which means to do this without thinking twice, he set out to remove the weapons that covered the trough. So the kids are trying to analyze this, and then they have to figure out, what does to do this mean? What is this? And so one of them says, we have to go back to the previous sentence. Okay, so the teacher shows the previous sentence, thus doing a very explicit bit of instruction on text reference. And they figure out in the previous sentence he wanted to give water to his mules. So in order to give water to the mules, he had to remove the weapons that covered the trough. This little phrase here, ni corto ni perezoso, is rather archaic, not one that kids understood at all, but one that they figured out by discussing with one another what neither short nor lazy could possibly mean in modern day Spanish. So it's yet another example, and we can put it on your website or something if you want, so to want to actually look at it. So how do we get to a place where we are not posing reading for meaning and reading accurately and fluently against one another as conflicting priorities, but in fact equally important and possibly integrated? Well, I think that just does require well-designed curricula like the butterfly curriculum in the kindergarten, or a curriculum organized around learning about animals, but then using that knowledge to write a guide for other students, an authentic task like that, that responds to student interests, that's challenging, but not too far beyond the student's level. And most of all, that's authentic and that's supported by discussion. And that means supporting adults in the curriculum with material, in the classroom with curricular materials and ideas. I think particularly in the early childhood era, a lot of the curricular resources we offer are really banal. They're kind of what kind of pizza do you like best? Or what did your grandfather do? Rather than anticipating the really complex domains of knowledge kids need for success. So one way I like to think about this is whenever I run across a 3 or 4 year old, I ask them what they're interested in, what they like to read, to be read to about, or what they want to talk about. And you get this fairly common list. I'm sure you could have a similar list. For kids in Ireland, there are the dinosaur kids who are really interested in fossils, and there are the superheroes kids who want to wear capes and jump off roofs. There are the kids who are really interested in friendship and barter and reestablishing the nature of their social relationships. Their kids are interested in fairy tales and fantasy, that side of the fantasy world, or music, or in food and holidays. These are what I would say are fairly everyday topics, but they are actually also interpretable as important, authentic scholastic disciplines. I mean, talking about dinosaurs gets you pretty close to talking about paleontology. Talking about jungles and beaches is geography. Talking about superheroes and competition is ultimately political science. And I think we could up the level of complexity of the way we talk about all of those things that young children are interested in order to build their knowledge bases so that they are ready for reading about these topics later in life. So I would argue that well-designed curricula provide topics that stimulate language and thinking, that offer teachers supports rather than constraints, but that create context for teachers to learn new practices. In particular, most importantly, I would argue the practice of engaging in classroom discussion in which all students have a voice. But they also create opportunities for the extension of time on task because the student interest keeps the authentic task alive. So The US question at the moment is, what does the science of reading prescribe? I think that's exactly the wrong question. That in fact, the better questions are, how do we ensure that first graders who are being taught to decode understand what that's for, why they need to learn to read, why they should want to learn to read? How do we integrate, even from those very early stages with fairly boring text, how do we integrate meaning with the code learning that we're doing to support learning literacy for authentic purposes, using writing to support authentic literacy, the sorts of practices that would ensure lifelong engagement with literacy, so that we can slow the swing of this pendulum back and forth from too much focus on code to too much focus on meaning, and make sure that we are balancing our attention to an enhanced view of decoding, to a rich view of oral and written language comprehension and knowledge, and a constant focus on the reasons why we want to be readers. So thank you very much. I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Catherine. A really interesting, a really rich talk. And just to say that we're lucky to be joined here by a number of people tonight who are really at the forefront of literacy in Ireland, spanning different organisations, colleagues across different departments in our own university, and practitioners. I suppose, Catherine, I have a question maybe, and I know you've alluded to this a little, but why has the term the science of reading become so popular politically, when it seems like science, evidence, data, research is not exactly in that package?
Well, it's in the package, but it's a decreasing part of the package, I guess I would say. Science is, of course, a term that people cannot critique. So if we call it the science of reading, then it has a certain glitter that folks who are not prepared or interested to dig into what the actual content of the package is don't can sort of accept as a positive thing. It has a bit of a history, I guess, in U.S. Policymaking. In 2002, the No Child Left Behind Act prescribed science-based reading research as the basis for what should be done in schools that were going to get federal funding. So SBRR was the precursor to the science of reading. And yet this notion that there is a science of reading, I think, is the really scary part of this. That it is not like science in every domain. The product of the provisional product of a consensus among people who know what they're doing, in a sense, which is what any scientific conclusion is, subject to revision, subject to further evaluation and testing. Yeah. So it's become much more of a motto than a claim.
Mm. I think, as Jimmy Kim says, there isn't the killer study. So there is this need for ongoing evaluation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the other challenges that you've been speaking about this evening, Catherine, is fundamentally an ideological one. So how do you think we can change minds and bring educators and researchers, perhaps too, back to the middle?
Well, I think part of the challenge is that researchers have had the upper hand, and the middle is almost is very much easier to contemplate and to work with if you're closer to practice, right? Because I mean, every first grade teacher knows that there are kids in this class who need a lot of phonics and kids who need a lot of vocabulary, and some kids who need a lot of both. But those are the teachers who are interested in reaching every child are not sufficiently influential in conversations with researchers who want to test the intervention and get a significant effect size. Because the effect size doesn't talk about every child. The effect size is quite a different entity from what do I do for Liam in the corner over there or Monica in this corner. So I would argue that sort of rational middle of the, by middle of the road, I don't mean wishy-washy, but I mean realistic approaches are much more likely to be on the table if we are engaged in research practice partnerships that truly take into account the knowledge of practitioners and curate it with the same care and reverence that we have attached to the curation of knowledge produced by researchers in more laboratory settings.
And this synergistic approach, if we could call it that, obviously builds trust between these communities that may have been polarized historically as well, I guess, to some extent.
I think they've been very polarized, and I think to some extent these arguments about how to teach reading have exacerbated the polarization. The whole language activists recruited teachers very actively by telling them, no, we're treating you like professionals, and those phonics folks, they're treating you like hypodermic syringes delivering their treatment. And of course, that wasn't necessary, right? I mean, people who write phonics curricula are writing them to support teachers in doing a better job, just as, but teachers will clearly be seduced into thinking, oh yeah, I'd rather be the professional who does what he wants to do than the person who's just delivering a prepackaged program. And it's a very interesting phenomenon. It's not as if, I mean, we don't let MDs do whatever they want to do. We ask that they stick to the well-defined protocols for their profession, so that they're not reinventing an appendectomy every time they're doing one. And yet there is this sense in a subset of the teaching profession that you should be able to close your door and do whatever you want to do.
This kind of, I suppose, individualism that Lorty talks about, that you are this radically autonomous professional and probably not in tandem with contemporary professionalism. Another question I have, Catherine, comes from an audience member. Given that we're in Ireland and you and I have spoken about this a lot, there's our immersion education for Irish Gaelic. And so tonight this evening, you've alluded a lot to this battleground, if you like, and the balancing of meaning and code. And to what extent do you feel then the principle of integrating meaning and code applies equally in contexts where the home language is different to the language of instruction?
The home language is presumably the stronger language, right? The language in which code can be, in which meaning can be recruited to support code analysis. One of the major ironies of English instruction in the US is that in the year, when it's in schools where it's very phonics and decoding oriented, second language speakers of English do quite well because they can learn the code at that level and learn to the difference between sh and sh with no problems. But because their language skills are not being developed with this heavy emphasis, they then falter in second grade, third grade, as the texts become more complicated, the vocabulary becomes expanded. I think it's a very heavy lift in any deep orthography to try to learn to read a language you don't speak fairly well. If it's a very shallow orthography, that's not so hard. You can apply the code unfailingly, but even early in English, it's pretty clear that you need a lot of oral language to be able to distinguish between alternate possible pronunciations of words. So I would argue, and I have argued in the States, and nobody has ever paid any attention, that we shouldn't, for second language speakers of English, try to teach them to read in kindergarten at all, that we should focus on oral language skills and postpone reading instruction until they've got 1,000 words of English vocabulary or something like that, something to work with. And that's because comprehension does support decoding, just as decoding then can support comprehension. But it's very tempting just to teach kids the code, because you don't need to worry about this huge domain of language if you're just teaching letter sound correspondences.
Yeah. To finish maybe on a question of optimism, and to support those students of ours who are, proficient readers. And you talked during this evening's session about avoiding forfeiting the advantages of being proficient readers. What can teachers do to support these students as well? I mean, one of the common things that we do in Ireland, whatever the evidence basis, is drop everything and read for a couple of minutes and off we go again. What else can we do to expand this repertoire?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned drop everything and read, because that was a fairly common practice in American schools. And then the National Reading Panel report actually included that as one of its instructional programs that it evaluated, and reported that it found no evidence that it worked. And thus, schools widely interpreted that finding as it doesn't work, which is not what they reported. They reported that there was no evidence from high quality, rigorous studies that it did work. And yet, there's vast evidence that more reading leads to greater fluency, which is one of the things you want to ensure students achieve. Aside from drop everything and read, which I would argue, I think the evidence is now accumulating that it does work, but it works under rather good constraints of making sure that kids are really reading, that they're reading books at about the right level. There's some accountability for what they're doing. But book discussions, book clubs, interest-based reading groups rather than level-based reading groups. 6 kids who are obsessed with frogs could all be reading about frogs at different levels and teaching each other about frogs, but becoming experts on what their books are telling them about frogs, and then in the social context, acquiring both more knowledge and more motivation to read and become even more expert. I think those approaches work because they are authentic literacy practices. They're the same kinds of practices we engage in as adults in book clubs, after all.
Catherine, all that remains for me to do is to thank you for really a sincerely engaging talk that really was expansive, and I think will have appealed to the very broad audience that we had this evening. So on behalf of the School of Education at Trinity College and on behalf of the LUMIERE Research Group, thank you again very much. And it's been great to see you again and to exchange a few words this evening about this really crucial topic.
Thank you. It's been fun, and I want you to go away realizing that things are probably better in Ireland than they are in the US in this domain.
And I think we have a few more nuggets about how to keep up making that more optimal still. Thank you very much, Catherine, and good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us this evening.